Where's it gone here? I'll get this right.
Who can I hear?
Hello, Sydney here. I can't get this pictures gone away again. Oh.
Just hang on a minute, Sydney. It'll be up in a sec, I think.
Okay, thanks. Oh, wait a minute.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our Tisha B'Av service. I'm delighted to welcome everybody here. My name is Richard Wolf. I'm the chair of Shire Tzedek, and I will be hosting this evening alongside my colleague Stephen Rabin. If you have any problems during this evening, please send us a private message in the chat, but otherwise you'll find this feature disabled. We'll be using the Reform Movement Siddur this evening, and if you don't have a copy at home, you can view it online, and I'll be posting a link in the chat very shortly. And now I'm going to hand over to Rabbi Debbie Young-Summers to start the service.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you and welcome to everybody who's here tonight, whether you're joining us on Zoom or on one of our community's live streams. We're really honoured that we could all come together with this chance to reflect and learn together as we consider how Jews have again and again moved from tragedy to resurgence and regrowth. The coming together of our three communities collaborating in a totally new way this year seems utterly appropriate. Just as the rabbis in the generations that followed the destruction of the temple endlessly reformed Judaism to speak to their generations and to speak to a world without a temple, we continue to ask how our Judaism can speak to our reality here and now. In a few minutes, we're going to hear the beautiful voices of a choir made up of our three congregations choirs, singing the words of Psalm 103, Enosh Gehatzir. Man, his days are like those of grass. He blooms like a flower of the field. A wind passes by, and it is no more. Its own place no longer knows it. Alone, we are each a blade of grass. We fade in the field, whether before our time or having lived a full life. But collectively, together, we cannot be trampled. And rather than fading, we will continue to understand our history and build upon it to struggle forward. I'm honoured to now invite Sydney Budd, who has done so much for the EHRS community to ensure that Tisha B'Av has been honoured over the years, to light a candle and begin our service on page 402 of the Siddur.
Right, I will just count it out. Thank you. Thank you.
Sydney's now going to read on page 402 for us, and then we're going to hear the choir of Shari Sedek singing Enosh Gehatzir and Hashivei and later by all three choirs.
Now, I'm now going to read on page 402. This is the piece for the 9th day of the month of Av. The prophet Zechariah identified the cause of the destruction of the first temple in God's anger at the lack of justice in that society. Execute true justice and behave to one another with loyalty and compassion. Do not compress the widow, the orphan, the stranger and the poor, and do not plot evil against one and another. When the rabbis asked themselves the cause of the destruction of the Second Temple, they answered, though Torah was studied and deeds of love were performed during its existence, it fell because of sinat chinam, groundless hatred. In another version, because they loved money and hated one another. On this day, as we read about past disasters which have afflicted our people, we mourn for the destruction we have known. But like the prophets and the rabbis, we ask ourselves about the faults of our own Jewish societies in our time and the responsibilities we have for what befalls us. Thank you.
We're about to begin with the recitation, the chanting of the book of Eicha, the book of Lamentations. And every time I hear it, it takes me back upon layer and layer of time to the times that I myself sat on the broken walls of Jerusalem and chanted these words myself on Tisha B'Av. We wonder, why does this book begin with the word Eicha? How? Why? It begins with this word because it begins with a word beginning with the letter Aleph. And as you will see, as we follow in the first chapter of Eicha, that each verse follows the order of the Hebrew alphabet, from Aleph to Tav, as if language itself is the only way to describe our experience of destruction and loss. So let's begin now with Eicha chapter 1.
Eicha yashva hadad ha'ir habatiam hayta ke'almana habati vagoyim sarati amdidot hayta lamas Bahoti v'kebalayla v'dimata alelecheya en la menachem mikol ohavea kol re'eha agduva ayula ve'oivim
גלתה יהודה מעוני ומרוב עבודה, היא ישבה בגויים, לא מצא מנוח, כל רודפיה השיגוה בין המצרים. דרכי ציון אבלות, מבלי באי מועד, כל שעריה שוממים, כהניה נאנחים, גדולותיה נוגות והיא מלאה. היו צריה לראש, אויביה שלו, כי אדוני יוגע לרוב פשעיה, עולליה הלכו שבים בפני צער. ויצא מן בת ציון כל הדרה, היו שריה כילים, לא מצאו מרעה, וילכו ולכך לפני רודף. זכרה ירושלים ימי אוניה ומרודיה, כל מחמודיה אשר היו מימי קדם. בנפול עמה ויצא, ואין עוזר לה. ראו הצרים, צחקו על משבטיה. חטאה ירושלים, על כן לנידה הייתה. כל מכבדיה הזילוה, יראו ערוותה, גם היא ננחה ותשוב אחור. טומאתה בשוליה לא זכרה, אחריתה ותרד פלאים, אין מנחם לה. ראה אדוני את עוני, הגדיל אויב. ידו פרסה על כל מחמדיה, יראתה הגויים באו מקדשה, אשר ציוותה, לא יבואו בקהל לה. כל עמה נאנחים מבקשים לחם, נתנו מחמדיהם, באוכל להשיב נפש. ראה אדוני והביטה, כי הייתי זוללה.
לא אליכם כל עוברי דרך, הביטו וראו אם יש מקום ma ovi asher olali asher ogar Adonai bayom aroz apo bimarom shalachei ba'amata Bayedena paras reshet leragalai shivani ako vatanani semaima kol hayom Dava Nigaka Nisaga Oh Shai Beado Ishtaranu Targu Alu Al Zavari Ish shel kochi b'tana nani o Adonai b'dei lo uchal kum salah kol birai Adonai b'kirbi Karai Moed Lishabo Bachurai Gam Dara Adonai Libatulai Bad Yehuda Eleani Ba Vokia an Aina Aini Yerdamayim Mirahei Mi many Menachem Mashiv Nafshi Hayu Banai Shomamim Kin Kanava Kava Oh yeah Perasha Zion Beyatecha Ein Malachem La Tiva Adonai La'ako Saviva Sarai Hayata Yusharalai Lani Nikinida Banehem Sadiq Adonai Ki Fahu Mariti Samuna Ko Yamim Makovi Batulotai Uvahurai Holahu Vashevi Vakarati La Akavi Vai Ema Rimuni Kohanai Uza Kani Ba'inarau ki bikashu ochel lemo ba'asivu et nafsham ra'e Adonai kitali may I Hamaramaru never libi bikaribi kimaro meriti mihuj shibala heref babayit mamavet Shamu ki ne'enachai ori ein menachem li kol oyo b'bai Shamu rati sashu ki ata asiti sita haba bata yom kavata bayu kamoni tavo kora ata lafanecha la le mo kashe laltali al sa kirabot anakotai olipi davai.
Please join me on page 66 of the Siddur, page 66, and I invite you to stand with me. V'hurachum yichaper von v'lo yashchit, v'hiraba lahashiva po, v'lo ya'ir kocha matzo. Baruch hu et Adonai ha'mevorach. Baruch Adonai HaMavorach le'olam va'ed.
Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher bidvaro ma'ariv aravim, חוכמה פותח שערים, ובתבונה משנה עיתים, הוא מחליף את הזמנים, ומסדר את הכוכבים במשמרותיהם ברקיע כרצונו. בורא יום ולילה, גולל אור מפני חושך, וחושך מפני אור. המעביר יום ומביא לילה, ומבדיל בין יום ובין לילה. אדוני צבאות שמו. ברוך אתה אדוני, המעריב ערבים. אהבת עולם, בית ישראל, עמך אהבת, תורה ומצוות, חוקים ומשפטים, אותנו לימדת. על כן אדוני אלוהינו, בשוכבנו ובקומנו, נשיח בחוקיך, ונשמח ונעלוז בדברי תורתך, ומצוותיך וחוקותיך, לעולם ועד. כי הם חיינו ואורך ימינו, ובהם נגה יומם ולילה, ואהבתך אל תסיר ממנו. Yameinu Leolamim. Baruch atah Adonai Ohev et Amo Yisrael. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto Leolam Vaed. Va'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha, v'chol levavecha uv'chol nafshecha, uv'chol meodecha, v'hayu hadvarim ha'ele, asher anuchi mitzavcha hayom al levavecha. V'shinantam levanecha, v'dibarta bam, v'shivtecha b'veitecha, uv'lechtecha b'derech, uv'shochbecha uv'kumecha, ukshartam leot al yadecha, v'hayu letotafot bein einecha, וכתבתם על מזוזות ביתך ובשעריך. We continue in silence until page 70. And on page 70. למען תזכרו, ועשיתם את כל מצוותיי, והייתם קדושים לאלוהיכם, אני אדוני אלוהיכם, אשר הוצאתי אתכם מארץ מצרים, להיות לכם לאלוהים, אני אדוני אלוהיכם. אמת ואמונה כל זאת, וקיים עלינו, כי הוא אדוני אלוהינו, ואין זולתו, ואנחנו ישראל עמו, העושה גדולות עד אין חקר, ונפלאות עד אין מספר, וראו בניו גבורתו שיבחו והודו, לשמו ומלכותו ברצון קיבלו עליהם. משה ומרים ובני ישראל, לך ענו שירה בשמחה רבה, ואמרו כולם, מי כמוך באלים אדוני, מי כמוך נדר בקודש, נורא תהילות עושה פלא. מי כמוך באלים אדוני, מי כמוך נדר בקודש, נורא תהילות עושה פלא. מלכותך אדוני אלוהינו, ראו בניך על הים, יחד כולם הודו והמליכו, ואמרו, אדוני ימלוך לעולם ועד. ונאמר, כי פדה אדוני את יעקב, וגאלו מיד חזק ממנו, ברוך אתה אדוני, גאל ישראל. Let's read our evening prayer, the Hashkivenu, in English. Source of our life and our sovereign, cause us to lie down in peace and rise again to enjoy life. Spread over us the covering of your peace. Guide us with your good counsel and save us for the sake of your name. Be a shield about us, turning away every enemy, disease, violence, hunger, and sorrow. Remove the temptation that awaits us and the guilt that lies behind us. Shelter us in the shadow of your wings, for you are a God who guards and protects us, a ruler of mercy and compassion. Guard us when we go out and when we come in. to enjoy life and peace, both now and forever. Blessed are you, God, guarding your people Israel forever. Baruch ata Adonai, shomer amo Yisrael la'ad. On page 72. Baruch Adonai bayom, Baruch Adonai balayla, Baruch Adonai b'shochbenu, Baruch Adonai b'kumenu. Hi v'yadcha nafshot hachayim v'hametim, asher biyado nefesh kol chai, v'ruach kol besar ish. Biyadcha afkid ruchi, v'dita oti Adonai el emet. Eloheinu shebashamayim, yached shimcha v'kayem malchutecha, tamid, umloch alenu leolam va'ed.
Echa Ya'iv ba'po Adonai et bat Zion, Hishlich mishamayim eretz, Tiferet Yisrael. V'lo zachar hadom raglav b'yom apo. Bila Adonai v'lo chamal. Eit kol naot Yaakov haras be'evrato. Mivtzarei vat Yehuda higia la'aretz. Chilel mamlacha b'sareha. Gata b'charei af. Kol Keren Yisrael, Heishiv Achor, Yemino Mipnei Oyev, Vayiv Ar B'Yaakov, Ke'esh Lehava, Achla Saviv. Darach kashto ke'oyev, nitzav yamino ketzar, vayaharog kol machamadei ayin, be'ohel bat Zion, shafach ka'esh chamato, haya Adonai Ka'oyev, Bila Yisrael, Bila Kol Armenoteha, Shichet Mivtzarav, Vayerev Bavat Yehuda, Ta'aniya Vaniya, Vayachmos Kagan, Suko, Shichet Moado, Shikach Adonai, B'Tzion, Moed v'Shabbat, Vayinat b'Za'am Apo, Melech v'Chohen, Zanach Adonai, Mizbecho, Ni'er Mikdasho, Hisgir B'yad Oyev, Chomot Armenoteha, Kol Natnu B'Veit Adonai, K'yom Moed. Chashav Adonai Lahashchit Chomat bat Zion, Natakav lo heishiv yado mibalea, Vaya'avel chel v'choma yachtav umelalu. Tav'u va'aretz sha'areha, Ibad v'shibar b'richeha, מלכך ושריה וגויים, אין תורה. גם נביאיה לא מצאו חזון מאדוני. ישבו לארץ ידמו זקני בת ציון, העלו עפר על ראשם, חגרו שקים, הורידו לארץ ראשן, בתולות ירושלים. כלו ודמעות עיניי, חמרמרו מעי, נשפך לארץ כבדי, על שבר בת עמי. בעטף עולל ויונק, ברחובות קריה. לאמותם יאמרו, איה דגן ויין, בהתעטפם כחלל ברחובות עיר. בהשתפך נפשם אל חיק אמותם. מה אעידך, מה אדמה לך, הבת ירושלים, מה אשווה לך ואנחמך, בתולת בת ציון. כי גדול קיים שברך מי ירפא לך, נביאייך הבו לך שב וטפל, ולא גילו על עוונך להשיב שבותך. ויחזו לך מסעות שווא ומדוכים, ספקו עלייך כפיים כל עוברי דרך, שרקו ויניעו ראשם על בת ירושלים. הזאת העיר, שיאמרו כלילת יופי, משוש לכל הארץ. פצו עלייך פיהם כל אויבייך, שרקו ויחרקו שן, אמרו בילנו, אך זה היום שקיווינו מצאנו ראינו. עשה אדוני אשר זמם, ביצע אמרתו אשר ציווה מימי קדם, הרס ולא חמל. וישמח עלייך אויב, הרים קרן צרייך. צעק ליבם אל אדוני, חומת בת ציון, הורידי חנחל דמעה יומם ולילה, אל תתני פוגת לך, אל תדום בת עינך. קומי רוני בלילה, לראש השמורות, שפכי המים ליבך, נוכח פני אדוני, שאי אליו כפייך, על נפש עוללייך, העטופים ברעב, כראש כל חוצות. ראה אדוני והביטה, למי עוללת כוח. כי תאכלנה נשים פריים, עוללי טיפוחים, אם יהרג. במקדש אדוני כהן ונביא, שכבו לארץ חוצות, נער וזקן, בתולותיי ובחוריי נפלו בחרב. הרגת ביום אפיך, טבחת, לא חמלת. תקרא כיום מועד מגורי מסביב, ולא היה ביום אף אדוני פליט ושריד, אשר טיפחתי וריביתי, אויבי חילם.
I'd like to invite everyone now to stand with me for the Amidah. We're on page 74. Adonai tzevatayv tiftach ufiyah gitahilatecha. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu v'Elohei Avotenu v'Elohei Imotenu. Elohei Abraham, Elohei Yitzhak, Elohei Yaakov. Elohei Tzara, Elohei Rivka, Elohei Rachel, Elohei Leah. El Hagadol v'Hagibor v'Hanura El Elyon. Gomel Chasadim Tovim Konei Hakol. V'Zocher Chasdei Avot B'imot. Umavi Goel Livnei V'neihem L'man Shemo B'Ahava. Melech Ozer Umashir Umagen. Baruch atah Adonai Magen Abraham Poked Sarah. Atah Gibor Leolam Adonai Mechayei Metim Atah Rab Lachoshia Morid Hatah. Mechalkel Chayim B'Chesed Mechayei Metim B'Rachamim Rabim. Tomek Noflim B'Rofei Cholim. Umatir asurim umechayem emunato l'shnei afar. Mi chamocha b'gvurot umidome lach. Melech meimit umechayei umatzmich Yeshua. B'nei eman atah lechayot metim baruch atah Adonai mechayei hametim. אתה קדוש בשמך קדוש וקדושים בכל יום יאכלוך סלע. ברוך אתה אדוני האל הקדוש. I'd like to invite us to continue in silence, and I will chant the Chatimot as we go through. Baruch atah Adonai Chonen hada'at. Baruch atah Adonai, harotzei b'tshuva. Baruch atah Adonai, Hanun hamabei lisloach. Baruch atah Adonai, Go'el Yisrael. Baruch atah Adonai, Rofei hacholim. Baruch atah Adonai, hamevarech hashanim. Baruch atah Adonai, mechayem nidchei amo Yisrael. Baruch atah Adonai, melech ohev tzedakah u'mishpat. Baruch atah Adonai, hama'avir isha min haaretz. Baruch atah Adonai, mish'anu miftach latzadikim. Baruch atah Adonai, Unei Yerushalayim. Baruch atah Adonai, matzmiach kerem Yeshua. Baruch atah Adonai, shomei tfilah. Baruch atah Adonai, hatov shemcha u'lecha na'eh lehodot. Baruch atah Adonai, hamevarech et amo Yisrael b'shalom. Oh, say shalom b'mromav, yaseh shalom aleinu ve'akol Yisrael, v'kol ha'olam b'imru. Amen.
Zechor Adonai Mehaya Lanu Habitu Ur'et Herpatenu Nahalatenu Mecha Zarim Batenu Nachrim Yutomim Hainu Ve'en Av Imotenu Ke'amanot מימינו בכסף שתינו עצנו במחיר יבוא על צווארנו נרדפנו יגענו ולא הונח לנו
One of them said a word to me.
מצרים נתנו יד
All of them. Had word
אשוב
to me. And I didn't say a word to me.
לשמוע לכם
Nothing.
אבותינו חטאו ואינם ואנחנו אבנותיהם סבלנו עבדים משלו בנו פורק אין ידם ונפשנו נביא לחמנו מפני חרב המדבר אורנו כתנור נחמרו מפני זלעפות רעב נשים בציון עינו בתולות בערי יהודה שרים בידם נתלו פני זקנים לא נערו בחורים תוהו נשאו ונערים בעץ כשלנו זקנים בשעה שבתו בחורים מנגינתם שבת משוש ליבנו נפח לבל מחולנו נפלה עטרת ראשנו אוי נא לנו כי חטאנו על זה היה דבק ליבנו על אלה חשכו עינינו על ציון ששמם שועלים חילחו בו אתה אדוני לעולם תשב כי שכר לדור ודור למה לנצח תשכחנו תעזבנו לאורך ימים השיבנו אדוני אליך ונשובה חדש ימינו כקדם כי אין מאסתנו קצבת עלינו עד מאוד
to take a moment and pause before we return to the last verse of Hashivenu, which is sung now by our three joint choirs of the joint choir of our three synagogues. Feel exactly as I have done over the years as I've sat in synagogue and heard the voices of members of so many communities chanting the words of Eicha, of lamentations. It's extraordinary that we've managed to create this sense of listening and sensitivity to each other's voices across so many spaces, we who have not even met each other. We're now moving to the learning part of our evening, and I'm just going to briefly tell you what's going to happen next. In a moment, we will begin with Rabbi Lou Feldstein, who joins us from Atlanta, Georgia. Rabbi Feldstein is, aside from being a communal rabbi, community rabbi, is a very, very experienced leader, consultant in change and growth of organizations. And we invite him here tonight to reflect on crisis, change and growth, something that he has worked with for 30 years and worked with us also here in the UK with the Reform movement. Some of us have met you, Lou, over the years working with us in Reform Judaism and our synagogues. We also will be introducing Rabbi Kath Vardy of Northwest Surrey Synagogue and Rabbi Debbie Young-Summers, who has recently joined the Edgware and Hendon Reform Synagogue. So we begin now with Lou.
It is really such a pleasure to be with you this evening, recognizing that this is not a pleasurable evening. It is an evening of mourning and of sadness. And yet even in sadness and growth, there is opportunity. I want you for a moment to take a journey with me and to reflect back a moment to Saturday, March 14th. It was a Shabbat. In the UK, it was a comfortable 11 degrees and slightly overcast. Many of us gathered together to celebrate Shabbat. The feelings of warmth and friendship radiated throughout the sanctuaries, wherever they were in the UK. And yet little did we know that this would be the last time that we would be together for many, many months physically. Now, I want you to imagine again, and I ask you to put up the slide, please. About 2,100 years ago, for those of you who've been to Israel, you're sitting on Mount Scopus, looking out across a valley. A mosque with a golden dome has not yet arisen, but instead of sitting on top of that mountain is one of the greatest glories of the ancient world, the Holy Temple, tall, firm, radiant, and magnificent, the center of the people's Judaism. And then we imagine a few years later and looking out again from Mount Scopus, we see a group of rabbis. And those rabbis don't see a magnificent temple, but instead, as described in this beautiful teaching from the Talmud Makot 24b, they see an empty mountaintop filled with rubble, destruction, crushed in despair, feeling hopeless. They gaze upon their hopes and dreams that have been crushed. And suddenly, as the text shows us, when they emerged, they saw a fox merging from the site of the Holy of Holies, the very place that no human other than the high priest could step. And upon seeing the fox, they cried and they wept and they ripped their garments in mourning. And yet, Rabbi Akiva, the great rabbi of that time, looked at the same sight and he asked, "Why are you weeping?" And he began to laugh. Laugh and laugh and laugh. Imagine laughing tonight. Imagine laughing during this time of COVID and despair. Next slide, please. And yet, as he laughed, he asked them, "Why do you weep?" And he turned to them and he said, "My friends, my fellow teachers, I laugh because the prophecy is true. The prophecy that Uriah and Zechariah both preached. It was taught that Uriah prophesied during the first temple and Zechariah during the second. And Akiva taught us that Zechariah's prophecy could not come to fulfillment until this first prophecy had taken place, the destruction of the temple. Next slide, please. And so we see here that Uriah prophesies, "Therefore, for your sake, Zion, shall you be plowed as a field, shall Jerusalem be destroyed." And this is what the rabbis focused on, and yet Akiva taught, no, focus instead on the prophecy of Zechariah. "There shall yet be elderly men and women sitting in the streets of Jerusalem." That the fox running across the ruins is truly a symbol of hope, that the temple will truly be rebuilt and that Jerusalem will once again be rebuilt. And the rabbi's response to their teacher, Rabbi Akiva, was, "You have comforted us." And he was right. For with the destruction of the temple began the genesis of a new Judaism, moving from a priestly Judaism to a rabbinic Judaism, a Judaism that is one that we live, that we embrace, and that we celebrate, and one that we could never imagine as long as the temple stood. And so Akiva's comfort was not only that Jerusalem would be rebuilt, but that Judaism would thrive and would grow. And so today it is so easy, and this is why I chose this text. It's so easy for us to mourn, for us to struggle with so much of what we've lost over these past 4 months and in the months to come. It is easy to focus in on that which has been lost, that which we don't get to touch, that which we don't get to celebrate in the same way. And yet Tisha B'Av truly teaches us that there is hope, that we can be comforted in what comes after despair, in what comes after destruction. Tonight, 3 congregations come together to observe Tisha B'Av in a way that would not have happened like it is tonight. Tonight, I get to sit with you from thousands of miles away to teach and to learn with you. And while we don't say that what came out of COVID has been good, there has been opportunity and there has been beauty. This truly is a remarkable time. And while there is remorse and feelings of hope and feelings of loss, there's also the potential for hope, for potential, for opportunity, and for encouragement. And so just as Akiva comforted his colleagues, let all of us, the 55 of us on Zoom and the others on the other vehicles who are joining us tonight, let us each comfort each other with the sharing of this evening and the power of community. The temple was destroyed and our synagogue buildings are locked, and yet it has not stopped us. We come together to comfort each other and to inspire each other with hope. Hope for a new day, hope for a reinvigorated Judaism, hope that together we can find peace and opportunities for another new beginning. It is what makes us Jews. It is what inspires us. And it is truly what gives us hope. This Talmud text truly inspires us.
Thank you, Lou. Our plan is to briefly respond. Our panel is going to briefly respond if we have responses, and then we will hear each of our speakers, and then we'll have time for responses from the community that we can see on Zoom. So I'm just going to ask first of all my colleagues, Kath and Debbie, for your thoughts and responses, questions to Lou very briefly before we move on.
So Lou, I have a question.
Hopefully I have an answer.
So one of the things I think that you were talking about was about reinvention, about how we reinvent ourselves, how we pick ourselves up from the ashes, and how we grow anew. And I want to ask you, what do you think we need to get there?
Well, I think we're actually on a certain level getting there. You know, I work with a lot of synagogues, a lot of synagogue boards, and the idea of change is often very threatening and very challenging. And so to say, okay, we're going to start Zooming services, there would be a long debate among the board, and it'd be, well, then people aren't going to come and things like that. Well, we overnight didn't change one thing, we changed multiple things. And now people who were not able to participate in services for whatever reason can easily participate in services. And so when we do get to come back to our buildings, when we do get to come back in human contact, those who aren't able to join us will still be able to join us. That creates a more inclusive and wonderful community. The use of technology in different ways, the use of new kinds of rituals that are being developed. All of these things would have taken years, countless council debates, council arguments, and we did it overnight. That's what really gives me both hope and inspiration.
Thank you. Debbie, do you have a question or a response?
Your text made me think of our relationship as progressive Jews to all of this. We have removed a lot of the hope for the return to the temple. And I think actually our strength and our vision has been in continuing that Jewish tradition of endlessly reinventing our hope. What do you think? Maybe it's too soon to say in the midst of COVID, but I wonder what our hopes for next year now are. We wouldn't have known 6 months ago where we would be today. What should we be hoping for now?
Oh, you know, there are so many ways to answer that question. My hope would be that we learn from what we've experienced and we don't actually go back to exactly the way that we were. You know, we talk about renew us as days of old, renew us, but that also means reinvigorate us. If we go back to the way we were on March 14th, we actually, I believe, will lose. And we'll leave people out, and we won't really have taken this opportunity to reinvigorate ourselves and to renew ourselves. So, you know, I think that what we do, what we hope for, is that when we do and are able to come back into our sanctuaries, when we are able to come back and be a community where we're in human contact with each other, that we don't leave all of this behind, but we remember these lessons. We take some of the changes that we've instituted and we actually keep those changes. When I hear rabbis say, we want to go back to the way we were, we want to go back to some of the ways we were, human contact. But in terms of many of the other things, I think it's really valuable for us to keep it in the same way that Rabbinic Judaism didn't discard what we'll call Temple Judaism. They took the temple sacrifice and they reinvented it in what Rabbi Vardy sang so beautifully, the Amidah. We took the ancient rituals and reinvigorated them and repackaged them for a new day. That's really what I'm hoping for.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lou. I think because of time, I'm going to ask you a kind of rhetorical question that maybe we can return to later. I'm so aware of the theme of weeping during the book of Eicha, and I'm wondering, when does weeping begin? When does mourning begin after crisis? How soon does it begin? Because in the initial shock of crisis, it feels it doesn't quite happen then. But I do want to say to you, Nicham Tanu, thank you. You have consoled us, and that is a wonderful thing. And it makes me aware that consolation, comfort, doesn't take away loss or pain, but it soothes us and helps us to rethink it. I'm going to now speak about, pick up a theme that actually, though we didn't plan it together, we did discover that we have a shared theme. My text is a halachic text, and I'm personally very passionate about halacha. I think of myself as a progressive halachist. I'm driven by halacha and how we adapt it to our times by teaching it to student rabbis, and creating it for the situations that we are in, because I think halacha shows us how to live, shows us how to behave, and that is full, for me, of theology, full of meaning. And I understand halacha as a kind of story, actually. And I'm going to show you a text from the Mishnah. The Mishnah is very, very important because it is the moment of the creation of the new Judaism that you spoke about just now, Rabbi Feldstein. And the earliest authors of the Mishnah, the text we're going to look at, were actually alive, and they saw the temple and they saw the destruction of the temple. But it took 5 generations for the Mishnah to be written down, to be edited by Yehuda Hanassi into the form that we know it today. So it actually has within it the stories and the memories, but they are reimagined stories and memories of the temple. So let's go over to my slide. Here it is. It's Moed Katan. And one thing I just want to briefly point out that I noticed that Rabbi Feldstein took his text from Makot, Masechet Makot of the Babylonian Talmud, and it's right at the end. It falls right on the last page of the Babylonian Talmud, Masechet Makot. And my Mishnah also is the penultimate Mishnah of the last chapter of this tractate. And that's meaningful, that the rabbis turn to death and loss as they come to the end of the work, as they start to think about what we've lost and how we go on living without what we had in the past. So that theme of an ending is also very powerful here. Now, what Moed Katan is concerned with is how we behave in intermediate time, not how we behave on ordinary days, and not how we behave on festival days, but how we behave on the intermediate days of festivals. So those are the days such as the days of Pesach that are not the festival days, or the days of Sukkot. And that's interesting because they are transient times that are in the boundary between festival and ordinary time. And this Mishnah teaches the law of mourning, not by telling us what to do when we mourn, but what we don't do on those intermediate festival days. And through that, we surmise, how do we mourn? How do we mourn, rather? So you see, I've chosen texts on mourning and grief, not on Tisha B'Av. And I do that because at the moment I find ourselves in a time which are immensely poignant, that we are having to find ways of mourning and grieving without all of the usual communal structures. What is surprising to me, and I think you may have had experience of this as well, is that there is still comfort in these new ways of mourning, and we are surprised by finding the intimacy and difference of mourning in this time does bring some comfort in a new sort of way. But here are the laws of mourning. They do not tear their clothes. Ein korin v'lo cholitzin. They do not loosen. Some people say it means loosen the shoulder, others that loosen the shoes. V'ein mavrin. They do not bring a funeral meal, a mourner's meal, except to those who are the close relatives of those who die on the intermediate days. We learn from this that these are the core behaviors to support those, or to the behaviors of those who mourn close relatives: tearing clothes, loosening, and being served a mourner's meal. And the mourner's meal is eaten on a mita sekufa, a bed that is turned over. You don't sit on an ordinary bed, you sit on a bed that is turned over. Your status is different. You sit in a different way. And food is brought to the house of mourners in ordinary times on a tavla or a vispakultzla, that's a Greek word, or a kanon. But on these days of intermediate times, just in a sal. So those first three ways of conveying food, the silver platter, the beautiful dishes, are used as a sign of respect and honor to the mourner. Maimonides teaches that you use always the best dishes so that you do not make any mourner feel that they are less important, they have less status than anyone else. But he explains that the basket is bought on the intermediate days of festivals, not the special one, because a basket is not also a sign that you're poor, because everyone has a simple wicker basket with which to serve food. And the mourners stand in a row, bashura, and they are comforted, ufotrin et arabim, and they allow the others to leave. I wanted to really think about this idea of tearing, kriya. It's a halacha that is not always performed now. The tearing of the clothing over the heart, or over the heart, exposing the heart in the time of Maimonides and other thinkers, because he explains it's a way of showing that the loss of the heart, an exposure of the heart. And he also teaches that even that this should be performed at the moment that the soul departs the body. But if that is not possible, it's performed in the first 7 days, or even in the case of a parent or a teacher or someone who teaches you Torah at any time, because those relationships are so dear and so beloved. But I also want to think about what kriya is. It is a tearing, a permanent destruction. It's a physical act. And indeed, all of those actions that we see in this Mishnah are physical. They concern the body. They're about embodying loss. The other Mishnah, the next Mishnah, which we won't look at today, talks about 2 or 3 other physical actions that are performed at a time of mourning: clapping the hands, wailing, and lamenting. This isn't something that's cognitive. It's about embodying loss. And I'm bringing it today because we're embodying loss together by creating this service, but we're also living in a time when embodying loss has become so very difficult. So I'm kind of chairing this moment as well. So I guess what I'd like to do is I'd like to invite responses from Lou, from Kath, and from Debbie, very briefly, to what I've talked about so far.
I really connect to that idea of kriya. It was a ritual that I was the only member of my family that wanted to perform it when mourning my dad. And it was a very visceral piece of sort of externally expressing what was happening internally, that ability to show the world how broken I felt externally. And it's as you said, it's not something that's always done today, and my mum really didn't want to do it. And I think it's really fine that we pick different things that will speak to us. But as you sort of alluded to in your closing remarks, I think one of the challenges that we now live through, and I was with a mourner this morning, that people haven't had the opportunity to really benefit from Jewish mourning rituals, which are so powerful in this time, because we haven't been able to gather, we haven't been able to sit shiver in the way we expect to. You know, I couldn't have touched a congregant to help them tear their clothes. And that I think it will take us some time to deal with that loss, because actually losing the mourning rituals is in itself another loss. And I think just to acknowledge that loss and need to revisit, I suppose, in the coming months. But that also reminds me of the fact that it took generations before, as a community, we understood what the destruction of the temple meant. And I think it may take some years for us to really understand the loss that we have experienced over these months, and may still continue to experience over the next year.
Thank you. I think what I'd like to do is just hear from Kath and Lou before I come back to you all. Is that okay? So Kath and Lou, are there any?
I'd like to follow up on Debbie's comment with really a question, which is, with the loss of the losses of the mourning rituals, and those mourning rituals which have both a physical and a psychological value to them, what's the ramifications? What are the implications to both, do you think, the individual and to the community, that those lost, that those were ripped away and not able to be observed in the way that has traditionally been done?
Kath, do you have any?
Yes, I was really struck by one of your opening comments, which was about weeping and asking, wondering, where are we as individuals and as communities in terms of our expression of grief? And I attended a seminar a couple of days ago looking at loss in the time of COVID, and what was presented was a really, I think, a helpful diagram, which is about our journey through this. That very often when crisis hits, we are energized and you know, and we do what needs to be done, but we can't keep that level of activity and energy up indefinitely, because it's pretty exhausting. And that as we begin to drop down and we begin to kind of fall into despair, that's the time when things are really, really hard. And of course, the truism is, you know, there's no way through pain except through pain. And I suppose I'm also beginning to wonder, and I'd really like to hear your reflections on how we can facilitate that and accompany ourselves as communities through that process. And how do we avoid the temptation to try and skip the pain because it's painful, and move into the next stage, you know? So how do we honor our losses in a way where we can grieve them healthily well?
Wow, I mean, I feel like all I can do is kind of reflect a bit on what you've all said and what this makes me think about. I feel that as we see Judaism developing, and particularly in the 20th century with the growth of, and the 19th, the 18th century with the growth of Reform, the impact of Reform Judaism in this country, the journeys of liberal as well as Reform Judaism. I think about how each generation has its historical task. And I think that those losses of ritual, they reflect that drive for assimilation and that drive for universalism that was so important to us, that was our historical task at those times that we were living in, as were the texts that we've learned this evening, and the melodies and the Book of Lamentations and all the voices that layer over that historically. So now we are facing our historical task in our time. I'm not sure that we ever historically have faced that quite so consciously. Perhaps we have, but I feel our historic task now in this time is to work out how do we grieve and mourn when we're disembodied. How do we embody ourselves again? And I come back to Kriya actually, because Kriya is a really interesting mitzvah. When you perform it, what you do is you help to make the first cut, but actually the individual tears it themselves. It's not done for someone else. I think one of the journeys that Reform Judaism has done is we've done a lot of doing for, but actually Kriya you perform for yourself. It's your own rending of your own garment. And this way of embodying experience must be refelt, must be retaught. And for me, I find the rich potential in that, in the imaginative thinking that's possible through a return to our halachic texts, which are stories, they are theology, and they teach that when we tear our clothing, that the universe is torn, but it is still there. It still exists. So I think we need to think about embodiment, and we need to understand that there is something new that comes from losses. By listening to people who've gone through losses, many of whom have said they feel comforted by this new experience of intimacy that we may feel is sometimes a lack of community, but there is more intimacy in this time. So finding our way through intimacy and embodiment in the ways that we're going to have to discover in the time ahead. So now I think we're going to go over to Rabbi Debbie Young-Summers. We're really excited to hear your text, Debbie, what you're going to bring to us now.
Thank you, Shamit. So I'm going to talk to two texts. If we can bring up the first slide, that would be lovely. Thank you. So this is this first part is from Tanit, which is a text looking at fasting. And I think it's a really interesting midrash on a theodicy, on how we understand why we are in this position, why we are mourning the destruction. And it's not necessarily a text that I feel very comfortable with in terms of theodicy, an understanding of God and evil. So the text says, it's further written, all the congregation lifted up their voice and cried, and the people wept that night. So this is quoting Bamidbar, Numbers. The Israelites characteristically are yet again weeping and moaning. Rabbi Yochanan said, that night was the night of the 9th of Av. The Holy One, blessed be he, said to them, you wept needlessly that night, and I will therefore establish for you a true tragedy, over which there will be weeping in future generations. And it's almost an image of a God who is a sort of petulant parent, saying to the Israelites, you're going to cry over nothing, I'll give you something to cry about. And I think the struggle of trying to understand how our ancestors have understood what has happened to them and what God has done and why, I would hope would be very different today. Certainly for me, it would be very different. And yet there's also something quite compelling to me about this image of God as a parent, whose children and he have a sort of dysfunctional communication. I think as a parent, particularly in COVID, actually, I've experienced that dysfunctional communication quite directly. And that sense of, you know, we do behave as parents sometimes in not the best way. I have behaved as a parent in not the best way all the time through lockdown. And this image of a God who is perhaps getting it wrong sometimes, in his parenting skills, in her parenting skills, I'm quite fascinated by and also struggling with. And I think that is part of the Jewish journey of how we engage with these texts, to struggle and to think about it. The second text I wanted to look at is from another piece of Talmud. A little bit later, it's sort of I jumped over a paragraph in this on this page of Ta'anit. So it continues. On the 9th, adjacent to nightfall, they set fire to it. That's the temple. And it continuously burned the entire day, as it is stated. Woe unto us, for the day has declined, for the shadows of the evening are stretched out. The verse is interpreted as a prophecy about the evening when the temple was burned. And this is what Rabbi Yochanan meant when he said, had I been alive in that generation, I would have established the fast only on the 10th of Av, because most of the sanctuary was burned on that day. And the sages who established the fast on the 9th, how do they respond to that comment? They maintain that it is preferable to mark the beginning of the tragedy. So I think for me, this text is again asking us, how do we remember? How do we decide how we create memory, how we create memorial, and that internal Jewish battle of, do we remember the beginning? Do we remember the time when it was all burning? Do we remember the end? First of all, how wonderful that we found even that to argue about within the rabbinic texts. But also there is a sense of at which point is our loss most keenly felt? At which point did perhaps that parent-child relationship most feel tested? And the testing of that relationship has continued through Jewish history and through Jewish memory. And I think one of the questions that I am grappling with as we sit at this moment in history is an understanding that, as we see in Ta'anit, it was 2 or 3 or 4 generations after the destruction of the temple before the rabbis began to really embed what meaning that destruction and loss would have for the future of the Jewish community. Our generation actually sit on the cusp of understanding what might the Shoah mean for our understanding of memory and history and retelling that story. And we're beginning to do that in different ways as we lose the last of those survivor voices in the next few years. I think what this period of loss and hopefully afterwards renewal will mean, perhaps it's not going to be our generation that decide that. Although being who we are, we will attempt to. And I just think it raises these wonderful images of how we actively engage with that attempt to create memory, that attempt to define what memory will mean going forward, to endlessly reinvent and reinvigorate ourselves as a community, despite it being rooted in loss.
Thank you so much. And I have a question for you. I suppose maybe like to think about while we gather up the other comments, which is, I suppose I'm really interested in what you say about being discomforted and how meaningful that is to you. And I don't know, I'm just not sure what I want to say more about that, but I'd love to, I find that quite inspiring, that it's actually about disrupting your ideas rather than having things settled and sorted. And I suppose I'm interested in then that process of memory and how feeling discomforted might be important in knowing what we're going to remember and how we want to remember. But I won't ask you to respond to me just yet, because I think that's a bit of an abstract kind of idea. But just to go over to Lou and Kath with any comments or thoughts that you have.
So first of all, brilliant teaching, just brilliant teaching. So thank you. the interpretation of the text in which God basically says, "I'll show you something," and your interpretation of it was really very insightful for me. Perhaps because I don't have small kids living at home anymore, so that side of that side I don't remember as much. But I also wonder whether could God in fact be teaching that loss is normal. And so we need to ritual, and the way to deal with the normalcy of loss is through ritual, but that, weeping is okay, but this is a normal part of life. And so embrace that there is going to be loss, and the natural reaction of so many people often is why or how come. And we don't know, but we know that it has to happen. And so could that be really the message that God or the rabbis are teaching, which is deal with it. There's loss. We just have to accept that.
Wow, thank you. Do you want to respond to that now, Debbie, or would you like to hear from Kath first?
I mean, I'm not sure. I'm not sure that there is any response. I think it's all learning, and I think that's the beauty of what Judaism means to me in some way, is that disruption, that disagreement, that endless testing of ideas is how we grow, how we mourn, how we change. And absolutely, I think Lou's right that we do need to experience loss and accept it, but actually that disruption also changes us in every time it happens. And yes, to embrace that change, but also to allow ourselves, I think, as we were saying with the Kriya idea, Judaism gives us these spaces usually to really feel our brokenness, and then in feeling our brokenness, allow ourselves to continue to live. And actually, it's when we don't allow ourselves those moments, when we don't feel it's comfortable or okay to weep and mourn in those times that Judaism affords it to us, it actually makes it much harder to get on with living again afterwards.
Mm-hmm. So that really makes me think about what you're saying about the generations that need to mourn within the time before we can really mourn the Holocaust. Thank you. Kath, do you have any comments for Debbie before we go on to you?
So I made myself a little notes and I wrote down the vulnerability of joy. Because when you were talking, the image that flashed into my mind were the celebrations, the VE celebrations, the VJ celebrations at the end of the war. Because you conjured up this image of an event that actually has a time scale to it, but ultimately comes to an end. And I was asking myself, I wonder what we will do as societies if we get to a point where we feel that this crisis has been securely bookended in terms of that celebration. But I think, I suppose what I want to reflect on, I think something I said earlier, there's no way through the pain but through the pain. And I think I would like to just echo a lot of what's been said, which is that actually grief is not comfortable. Weeping is not comfortable. This stuff hurts. It really hurts. But the tragedy about it is, I think, is that when we avoid experiencing that, then we also rob ourselves of the ability to experience joy. And that, and we often we're stuck in this very strange paradox of really joyful moments that we can't, or we're unable to fully surrender to, because what comes, steaming into our brains like a hammer is, oh, yes, but what if this happens? And so that, and that we live with that tension. And I think that the power of Jewish ritual and the calendar is that we have opportunities to really begin to embrace our pain and viscerally. And Shulamit was talking about the how we embody our grief. So those are the things that were going on in my mind as you were talking.
Thank you,
Kath. May I ask Kath a question on her comment? Kath, so was Rabbi Akiva wrong? Did he, in fact, by laughing, not allow them to weep, to mourn, and this is to all of you. What, I mean, as I was listening to it, it posed the question, while I looked at Rabbi Akiva in one way, was he in fact wrong?
Or maybe Akiva is actually quite dysfunctional, I mean, we will remember him at Yom Kippur. He's the head of the list of the martyrs. And it's he who is saying, oh, now I'm being tortured to death. Now I understand what the meaning of the Shema is, and there's these wonderful, terrible stories actually about him in intense pain and suffering. His body is being burnt alive. And he's saying, now I understand with all your strength and with all your heart. So perhaps there's something a bit dysfunctional that's been planted in us by Rabbi Akiva's story, or I don't know, maybe it's more of the disruption and discomfort that Debbie is saying is helps us to grow, perhaps, rather than giving us comfort. Perhaps he's the comforter who uncomforts us, who discomforts us. So let's go on to Kath now. Kath, you also have a really fascinating text to share with us.
So I think we're going to put the first one up. What I wanted to talk to us about was about becoming. I want to think about what does it mean to become. I think I've given this inside, outside, punctuation and creating meaning in the act of becoming. We are currently living in a space as individuals and as communities that we didn't choose. This, this crisis, it happened, it landed, and we are where we are, but we didn't choose to be here. And I want to think about what that means, about the significance of the space that we find ourselves in. And before I kind of begin to start talking about the text, I want to ask you a question. I want to ask us a question, and I'd like to invite you just to hold that question in your mind. And the question is who do we choose to be for this time? Who are we choosing to be for this time? So the texts that I've chosen come from Yoma, the tractate of the Talmud that explores and deals with Yom Kippur, and the rabbis are involved in what becomes a very detailed discussion about the dividing line between the sanctuary and the Holy of Holies. And in the first temple, these two spaces in the temple were divided by one single wall, and it was a wall that was a cubit thick. And in the second temple, that wall doesn't exist. And so instead, what exists are two hanging curtains. And the rabbis are really concerned about how do we designate this space. So we've got the sanctuary, the Holy of Holies, and then we have this space here in between, which is designated by these two curtains. And they're asking, does it belong to the Holy of Holies, or does it belong to the sanctuary? And this is what they're grappling with. And so we have a quite a detailed legal discussion about what this space should be thought of as. And I want to just take us to the second slide, because the wall in the first temple was called a terrason. Yes, called a terexin, which is a Greek word. So this wall was called a terexin, and the thinking is that it's a Greek loan word, and maybe it's related to terrason. And if there are Greek speakers out there, my apologies in advance, because I'm probably doing something really horrible to the language. But terrason means guard. So was that wall a gatekeeper, acting as a gatekeeper, separating these two areas of the temple? But also there's another suggestion that actually this word of terexin could be an amalgamation of two Greek words, which is thorasi, which means outside, and esothen, which means inside, outside, inside. So it is both inside, it's both outside. So therefore, how do we designate this particular area? So they begin to have this question about where does it sit, until eventually we're told that actually the wrong question is being asked. And actually it's not about the architectural details, about whether it's, you know, this far away from the north wall or that far away from the south wall, that will designate whether it belongs to the Holy of Holies or whether it belongs to the sanctuary. But actually the right question is to ask, is this space in and of itself sacred space, regardless of whether it belongs to the Holy of Holies or the sanctuary? But is that space, that 1 cubit space between these two curtains, is it sacred space? And so we then get to this really interesting part of the conversation, the rabbinic conversation, where one of the rabbis says, actually, this is like punctuation, and it just depends where you put your commas. So depending where you put your commas and your semicolons and your full stops, you can totally change the meaning of your sentence. And so whether we designate it as you know, inside or outside depends where we decide to put our commas. So that's the first thing that I'd like you to hold, this, you know, that we are in this liminal space, but we know that it's sacred space, but we're not quite sure which part of the temple it belongs to. And if we can just move on to the next slide. So we jump a little bit in this discussion, and we get to something which I think is really, really interesting. So the rabbis have decided that it is sacred space. And we then get a discussion about what happens when the high priest walks through. So if you can imagine, we've got these 2 curtains, and we're told that at the entrance, the one curtain is hooked back. So one curtain is straight down to the ground, and the other one is hooked back. So it creates an entrance. And that as the high priest walks through these curtains, that he doesn't walk in a straight line, but actually it's like an elongated S. Now, for me, this is a really powerful, and it's a stunning image of you know, for a metaphor of journeying. So the entrance is held open. We begin to walk in this space, but we can't see left nor right because we are, you know, we are kind of confined by these curtains. But to our left and to our right, we have different spaces which we know are sacred spaces. And we're moving in towards the Holy of Holies, and he's walking in this S shape. And he doesn't actually see the end until he gets to the end. He doesn't see the light, if you like, until he's literally there, where the other part of the curtain on the other side is hooked open for him. But that high priest walks with intention, because he's carrying his fire pans with the coals, and he's carrying that in order to put that near to the ark, possibly on the foundation stone, and to present the incense to God. So he is walking into the unknowable. The priest is walking into the Holy of Holies. He's walking into the unknowable and the unknown, the ultimately unknowable and unknowns. And I think that has, so for me, that really speaks to me. I think we can take the slides down, actually, thank you. I think we are walking between the curtains. That is what we are doing. You know, we like the high priest. The curtain has been opened. We know that the curtain is opened on the other side, but we are walking in this elongated S shape. And I want to draw the comparison between what is happening, you know, what we imagine might be happening to this high priest as he walks from the sanctuary through this holy space into the Holy of Holies, carrying his fire pan, but he's also going on a journey of becoming and entering into this awesome space of unknowable unknown. and to draw the comparison between that journey and our journey, both as individuals, as a wider society, and as Jewish communities here together, because we are also walking that path with intention. Right? We can't see that final curtain that is open yet, but we know that we are moving into something which is both holy and sacred and unknowable, right? And I think ultimately unknowable. But this is it. It's so that this process of that we're in this time of COVID. It's a period of huge anxiety and uncertainty, and it's a period of real heightened emotion, and that lends a real urgency to this journey that we're undertaking. But we don't know how long. We are always kind of heading round the corner, but we don't quite know whether that corner is going to kind of carry on bending, and if so, for how long. And that can be a very uncomfortable place to be. And I think, often we can experience that as a very uncomfortable place to be, but it's also a place of huge possibility in terms of the vista that will open, that we get to the foundation stone eventually. And I suppose I want to finish by bringing in a midrash that comes from Exodus Rabbah, which tells of a discussion between Moses and God when God is giving Moses the instructions to build the tabernacle. And Moses says, how can we build a tabernacle that will how can we build something big enough, grand enough, awesome enough in order to house God? I mean, how can anyone house God? Because God is beyond, ultimately unknowable. And God says, I will come down and I will contract myself into 1 square cubit. Right? And that is the space between those curtains. That's that square cubit between the curtains. And when the high priest is walking between the curtains in that journey, which may feel dark and restricting and constricted, and he can't see left nor right, he can only see down this kind of dark corridor, intentionally carrying his pan, he is not walking that journey alone. He is accompanied, right? God is there in that 1 cubit. He is being accompanied. We are being accompanied. So, and how we walk that and how we accompany one another, then I think, that's up to us to decide. So I bring us back to this opening question, who do we choose to be for this time? Who do we choose to be as individuals, as communities, and as a wider society? Because who we choose to be will directly influence how we are accompanied and how we are able to accompany one another.
Shakar, Kath, that was amazing. Thank you. I'm conscious of time. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to open this up for comments and questions to everyone who is here on Zoom. I don't think we can handle anything from Facebook, sorry. So we're going to now ask you see the participant bar tab at the bottom of your bar. I think if you open that, you can raise your hand. I see that Stephen Curtis has raised his hand. Stephen, what I'm going to do is I'm going to collect questions and comments in a group, and then I'm going to bring them back to the panel. So Stephen, we hope we can find you. Over to you. We have found you. That's brilliant.
Yeah, I don't know what point I'm trying to make, but in the Rivers of Babylon psalm, where there's a yearning for the exile people in Babylon to return to Jerusalem, when they're given the opportunity, we know historically, when they're given the opportunity, they don't take it up, they don't return. So, I mean, does that mean that, like I said, I don't know what point I'm trying to make, but does it mean that people like the attendance synagogue the way it is now, by not physically being there, by being in virtually there, or do they want to return, or does it make any difference? that's the point I'm trying to make.
So you made it very beautifully, actually. Thank you. Will we go back, or will we be back to a place we've never been, or will we want to go back, and how? That's an anxiety. Rena, over to you now, Rena.
Yeah, so my question is how we deal on days like today with kind of grief we anticipate but has not yet arrived. So for me, I mean, as I suppose a younger person, one of those things is thinking about climate grief and things like that. And in many ways, for me, I mean, yes, this pandemic will end, but I very much, this might be only one of other pandemics that are to come. And it feels that we really are moving as a world into a time of very great tumult. And so I feel like a sense of grief for what is to be, as well as what has been. And I was wondering about like how to deal with that kind of thing, and if you think there's any insights that you could share on that kind of subject.
Anticipatory grief, and someone who is thinking deeply about how, as we should, about the greater griefs that are ahead of us. Thank you, Rena. Do we have any other questions or comments?
None on the screen at the minute.
None on the screen at the moment. So actually, I think one of those comments is about, do we ever go back? But both of them are about how do we go forward, and how do we, where is the strength to be gained through entering this incredibly uncertain time, and a time when we do know, although we call it anticipatory grief, it's really hard to grieve for something unless you understand that it is happening, that you have understood, you kind of take it inside yourself in a deeper way, as I think Rena you're implying, that and that there's a place where you feel yourself to be, but that so many people are not yet there. So I'm going to go back now to Rabbi Lou Feldstein, and I'm going to ask you to respond and to wrap up for us this part of the evening.
One of the rituals that came out of the destruction of the temple was the idea that learning is actual tefillah, is actual prayer. The idea of learning together, and rather than being a passive observer watching what was happening at the temple, that we would be actively engaged through the practice of Torah Lishma, which is of active learning of Torah, which is really what we've done tonight. What we've also tried to, and I think each of the rabbis touched on it and both of the questions touched on it, which was to find answers, to discover meaning in the midst of, and as two of the rabbis actually taught, so much of what came after the destruction of the temple came after 5 generations, after multiple generations. When we look back at our history, which is filled with cataclysmic events, pandemics, plagues, all kinds of horrible things, we try to address in the middle often, but the real meaning, the real understanding of it truly comes about after. But we don't know when after is. We don't know when this ends. And so trying to define purpose, trying to define understanding at this time becomes that much more challenging. And yet we also have a wonderful teaching that comes from the Talmud, which happens at the end of each tractate of the Talmud, and also happens at the end of each book of the Torah, where we literally say, chazak, chazak, v'nit chazek, that, even in endings, even in hard conversation and in hard learning and in hard life, we will be strengthened by this, that we will find the strength. We find the strength to come together. We find the strength by being a part of each other. And then through that strength of the collective, we will truly all be strengthened, and we will really go on. And that's when we renew our days of old, when we do things differently, but we renew them by being together again as community, just as we are tonight.
We now move towards that communal moment as we stand together with Rabbi Mark Goldsmith on page 310.
עלינו לשבח לאדון הכל, לתת גדולה ליוצר בראשית, אשר בחר בנו מכל העמים, ונתן לנו את תורתו. ואנחנו קוראים ומשתחווים ומודים לפני מלך מלכי המלכים, הקדוש ברוך הוא, שהוא נוטה שמיים ויוסד הארץ, ומושב יקרו בשמיים ממעל, ושכינתו זו בגובהי מרומים. הוא אלוהינו אין עוד, אמת מלכנו אפס זולתו, ככתוב בתורתו, וידעת היום והשבות אל לבבך, כי אדוני הוא האלוהים בשמיים ממעל, ועל הארץ מתחת אין עוד. On page 313, as Sidney Budd began tonight, he spoke about sinat chinam, groundless hatred, which drove us apart and caused us to be in the right condition for the destruction of the temple. This version of Al Kain Nakaver is about shutafim, about partnership for the repair of the world. Therefore, Almighty God, we put our hope in you. Soon let us witness the glory of your power, when the worship of material things shall pass away from the earth, and prejudice and superstition shall at last be cut off, when the world will be set right by the rule of God, and all humanity shall speak out in your name, and all the wicked of the earth shall turn to you. And then all who inhabit this world shall meet in understanding, and shall know that we are all partners in the repairing of your world. For yours alone is the true reign, and only the glory of your rule endures forever. For so it is written in your Torah, the Eternal shall rule forever and ever. For so it is prophesied, the Eternal shall be sovereign over all the earth. Bayom hahu yehye Adonai echad u'shamo echad. As we prepare to say the Kaddish, we think first of all of those who are among us tonight, who are within the first week of a loss of a loved one, or within the Shloshim, or within the first year, who are commemorating Yahrzeit. And we also think of all of those who lost their loved ones during the tragedies and the chaos which overtook Jewish communities on Tisha B'Av, all down the generations. Please join me as we say the Kaddish. Yitgadal v'yitgadash Shemei Rabbah. V'alma divrach chivutei v'yamich malchutei. V'hayechon v'yom echon, v'chayei d'chol Beit Yisrael. V'agalau v'zman kariv v'imru amen. Yehei Shemei Rabbah mevorach le'olam ul'almei almaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitba'a v'yitromam v'yitnasei. V'yitada v'yitalei v'yitalal Shemei d'kudesha berichu. Le'ela min kol berchata v'shirata. Tushbachata v'nechemata. Damiram ba'alma v'imru amen. Yahei shalom rabba min shemaya. V'chayim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. V'sei shalom b'imromav. Hu ya'asei shalom. Aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'al kol ha'olam v'imru amen. Ashivenu Adonai elecha v'nashuva Chadesh yameinu kakedem Chadesh yameinu Laila Tov.
Now, at the end of our service, we would go on. Traditionally, Jews continue now into the night with the recitation, the singing of Kinot. Kinah is translated as an elegy, a dirge, or a lament. It's not a very familiar form of literature to us today, at least here in England. It does have to be said, though, that the lament is a very important part of traditional song and poetry, for example, in Ireland or in Scotland. This is the best known one that you'll see now on the screen. Many communities sing it now at the end of the evening service. There are people who then sing many, or recite many kinot into the night. There are a good 40 or 50 traditional kinot for the eve of Tisha B'Av, and there are others that are said in the morning. So here you have the text, and I used the melody a little earlier for Micha Mocha, and I'm just going to do it as a die-di-die. I hope people will be able to sing along. We do it's like a refrain, the very first verse, and then I've chosen approximately, I think, 4 verses or maybe 6. It's quite a long dirge, quite a long elegy. Yai dai dai dai, yai dai 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 dai, yai 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 dai 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 dai, yai dai dai dai. Eli Tzion ve'ahareha kamo isha b'tzireha v'hivtula chaguratsak al bal neureha ahalei harmon asher nutash בהשמצון הדריה, ועל ביד מחר פאל, בתוך מקדש חדריה. אהלי גלות משרתיאל, נימי שיר זמריה, ועל דמם אשר שופח, כמו מי יוריה. אהלי הגיון מחוליה, אשר דמם בעריה, ועל ועד אשר שמם, וביטול סנהדריה. אהלי זבחי תמידיה, ופדיוני בחוריה, ועל חילול כלי היכל, ומזבח קטוריה. אלי ציון והריה, כמו אישה בציריה, וחיבתולה חגורת שק, על בעל נעוריה. There are no greetings on Tisha B'Av. There are no traditional greetings, and indeed, we're not actually supposed to greet each other on Tisha B'Av, but there is a custom of wishing one another Tzom Kal. It is a fast, a serious fast for those who are capable of fasting, for whom it's right. And those words simply mean an easy fast or a light fast. May it be Tzom Kal for you.